I'm Kendra, and my husband Blake and I have been coming to Hamilton Hills for about 4.5 years now. I had the privilege of growing up in a household where we were at church all the time because my dad was on staff at a church. A lot of my earliest childhood memories involved the church. Kind of grew up in that like picture perfect home, if you will. We were the family that was always at church and that things were going great. And so sometimes I felt like because I had grown up in a home where Jesus was all I ever knew, and I never went down this crazy path. I think about stories in the Bible like Paul, where, he had this past life where he was legitimately persecuting other Christians, and God appears to him and he has this huge radical conversion moment. And for me, I didn't feel like I had a cool story like that. I was a kid who was brought up in church and who always knew the love of Jesus, but I didn't feel like my story was worth sharing because I had never had that radical moment where God had to reach down in the pit and pull me out. And it wasn't until I got a lot older and realized that rules and just trying to always do everything right wasn't what my relationship with Jesus was all about. I realized that regardless of what the sin in my heart was, that I struggled with things and that my struggles were not any better or any lesser than anyone else's struggles. And so I came to realize how great God's grace is. So now when I think about the story that God has given me to share, if I'm honest, I can still struggle with feeling like it's not enough, because I think at the heart of a lot of the things I struggle with, it is feeling like I'm not enough. But I think we can all find ourselves in that same boat of just feeling insecure, feeling like we aren't enough. But the beauty of what God has done in my story is that He has shown me that He is enough and His power is made perfect in my weakness. And so if I just bring the story that He has given me, however boring I might think it is, if I bring that story to Him and continue to allow Him to use me, then I can share the love of who Jesus is and the goodness of His grace with the people that are in my Oikos even now.
My name is Brad, and I've been coming to Hamilton Hills for about 2 years now. Coming out of a background of drug abuse and addiction, and then coming to know Christ at a later age, I'd made this decision at 20 years old to go to a Christian college where I was surrounded by people who had grown up in the church. And for me, in my story, that wasn't necessarily the case. I'd been to church a couple times, then I'd spent years out of church. I remember hearing people at our college, sharing their story, sharing, how they had grown up. And I remember the insecurity that built up in me of like, man, I can't share my story. I can't share that, 3 months ago, I was like dealing drugs out of my fraternity house. Like I can't share that with people. And so I just held it in. And I remember we were on a missions trip to Spain at the end of my first year, and I'd been walking with the Lord for about a year at this point. And on the trip with me was someone in my Oikos. He had no idea how big of a part of my story he was, and I had never shared that with him because I was so insecure. He was a pastor's kid. He grew up in the church. He was there every Sunday, every Wednesday night, all that stuff. And I remember, we're sitting in this circle, and one of the missionaries we were working with at the end of this trip had asked us to all share, hey, what's your guys' story? And it started going around in a circle. And, I had this rehearsed like fake testimony that I had been telling people like, oh, I grew up in church and, I knew about Jesus from an early age. And none of that was true, really. It was the very first time I'd really felt a very severe prompting from the Holy Spirit And he just kept saying, share your story, share your story, share your story. And then I looked over at him, this guy in my Oikos, and I thanked him and shared what an immense part of my faith and my walk he had been. And I remember just seeing tears start streaming down his face. And I had no idea how that would impact him. And it kind of clicked in that moment. I hadn't just been holding back my story. I had been holding back, God's story through me. What I was really doing was essentially trying to handcuff God from doing what he was going to do. I've just seen, as I've shared with people, the weakest moments of my life, the things that I struggle with, as I've been open about that, I actually see it has the opposite effect on people than I thought. Like, people are actually more drawn to that. And then they have more questions about, so who is this Jesus guy that you're following? It's really cool when you start to share your weakness so that God gets the glory, and to see how that actually reaches other human hearts.